When the last Roman ships vanished beyond the gray horizon, Britain was left in a hush so deep that even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing its hills. The roads that once rang with the sound of marching feet now lay broken and half swallowed by weeds. Stone bridges sagged under their own age, and the proud villas of the empire crumbled into damp ruins, where ivy crept across painted walls and owls made their homes in forgotten courtyards. It was as if time itself had slowed, breathing softly over a land unsure of its own future. The people who remained lived scattered in pockets of green clusters of wooden huts by streams, tiny clearings carved from endless forest, little worlds wrapped in mist. Dawn came quietly, painting the fog in pale silver as cocks crowed and the first thin curls of smoke rose from thatched roofs. Men stirred the ashes of the hearth to life. Women fetched water from the river, and the same rhythm that had guided generations continued, steady as the turning of the seasons. To wake in dark age Britain was to know hardship as naturally as breathing. Food was never certain. Illness struck without warning, and comfort was something found only in the small warmth of family and fire. Yet, amid the struggle, there was a strange calmness, a slow, enduring patience that grew out of the land itself. The island had no master now, only memory. Once, Latin voices echoed across its fields. Now, new tongues whispered where legions once camped. Britons, Saxons, and stray wanderers from distant shores lived side by side or in quiet hostility, separated by customs, but joined by need. There were no cities worth the name, only the faint shadows of them. Londinium, a ghost of stone, Venta and Verulamium, reduced to silence. Travelers moved carefully, guided by stars and landmarks known by few. 4 roads were dangerous and forests deep, but for those who stayed in one place, life settled into a rhythm older than empire. Plow, sow, reap, survive. They counted time not in years or rulers, but in harvests, and winters survived. Children learned to listen more than speak, for their elders carried the world's knowledge not in scrolls, but in stories told by firelight, tales of Roman might, of Celtic spirits, of heroes whose names melted into legend. To these people, the past and the present were not separate things. They were threads of the same fabric, woven together beneath the watchful sky. Religion too drifted in this in-between world. The cross had come with the Romans and remained in some hearts. Yet the old gods of wood and water lingered stubbornly. In remote valleys, monks carved small crosses into stone and built humble chapels where candles flickered like distant stars. While beyond the walls, farmers left bread and milk at sacred springs for unseen spirits. Faith was not a battle, but a blending, the soft meeting of old and new under the endless gray sky. People prayed to saints and spirits alike, not out of doctrine but hope. Every thunderstorm was a message, every good harvest a blessing. The earth was alive with unseen presence, and the people walked gently upon it, half fearful, half reverent. When night fell, darkness was total, no lamps, no streets, only the orange heartbeat of the hearth and the faint gleam of moonlight through smoke holes. Beyond the safety of firelight, the woods murmured with secrets. Wolves howled in distant valleys, foxes barked near the edges of fields. and sometimes travelers swore they saw ghostly figures moving through the mist, perhaps memories of what the island had been. But fear gave way to habit. People learned to live with mystery. Theirs was a world measured in sounds, the crackle of wood, the soft lowing of cattle, the rhythm of raindrops on thatch. In such silence, thoughts became slow and deep. Without books or records, the mind filled its emptiness with imagination, shaping myths out of every ruin and meaning out of every star. And yet, even in this age of quiet survival, beauty persisted. On still mornings, the valleys glowed with dew, and the scent of wet earth mingled with woods. The fields, though rough, shimmered gold in late summer, and the rivers moved like sheets of silver through the meadows. Children laughed, lovers met in secret, mothers sang softly as they ground grain, and in those fleeting moments, the weight of the world seemed lighter. To call this time dark is to misunderstand it. The darkness was not absence, but depth, a stillness in which the land itself was dreaming. Though no chronicler wrote their names, though no marble monument bore their likeness, the people of this forgotten Britain carried the quiet courage that would one day build kingdoms. They endured hunger, fear, and cold, but they also found joy in simple things: the warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, the glow of sunrise after a storm. They did not know they stood between worlds, between the old order fading and a new one not yet born. To them, history was not something written, but something lived. Each breath, each dawn, each season, a thread in the endless weave of time. Centuries later, scholars would call it the Dark Age, but for those who lived it, it was simply life, slow, patient, and filled with moments of quiet grace. In that dimness, where the empire's light had gone out and no new flame yet burned, Britain rested like a seed beneath the soil, gathering strength for the spring to come. When the last Roman ships vanished beyond the gray horizon, Britain was left in a hush so deep that even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing its hills. The roads that once rang with the sound of marching feet now lay broken and half swallowed by weeds. Stone bridges sagged under their own age, and the proud villas of the empire crumbled into damp ruins, where ivy crept across painted walls and owls made their homes in forgotten courtyards. It was as if time itself had slowed, breathing softly over a land unsure of its own future. The people who remained lived scattered in pockets of green clusters of wooden huts by streams. Tiny clearings carved from endless forest, little worlds wrapped in mist. Dawn came quietly, painting the fog in pale silver as cocks crowed, and the first thin curls of smoke rose from thatched roofs. Men stirred the ashes of the hearth to life. Women fetched water from the river, and the same rhythm that had guided generations continued, steady as the turning of the seasons. To wake in Dark Age Britain was to know hardship as naturally as breathing. Food was never certain. Illness struck without warning, and comfort was something found only in the small warmth of family and fire. Yet amid the struggle, there was a strange calmness, a slow, enduring patience that grew out of the land itself. The island had no master now, only memory. Once, Latin voices echoed across its fields. Now new tongues whispered where legions once camped. Britons, Saxons, and stray wanderers from distant shores lived side by side or in quiet hostility, separated by customs but joined by need. There were no cities worth the name, only the faint shadows of them. Londinium, a ghost of stone, Venta, and Verulamium reduced to silence. Travelers moved carefully, guided by stars and landmarks known by few. 4 roads were dangerous and forests deep. But for those who stayed in one place, life settled into a rhythm older than empire. Plow, sow, reap, survive. They counted time, not in years or rulers, but in harvests and winters survived. Children learned to listen more than speak, for their elders carried the world's knowledge not in scrolls but in stories told by firelight, tales of Roman might, of Celtic spirits, of heroes whose names melted into legend. To these people, the past and the present were not separate things. They were threads of the same fabric, woven together beneath the watchful sky. Religion, too, drifted in this in-between world. The cross had come with the Romans and remained in some hearts, yet the old gods of wood and water lingered stubbornly. In remote valleys, monks carved small crosses into stone and built humble chapels where candles flickered like distant stars, while beyond the walls, farmers left bread and milk at sacred springs for unseen spirits. Faith was not a battle, but a blending, the soft meeting of old and new under the endless gray sky. People prayed to saints and spirits alike, not out of doctrine, but hope. Every thunderstorm was a message, every good harvest a blessing. The earth was alive with unseen presence, and the people walked gently upon it, half fearful, half reverent. When night fell, darkness was total. No lamps, no streets, only the orange heartbeat of the hearth and the faint gleam of moonlight through smoke holes. Beyond the safety of firelight, the woods murmured with secrets. Wolves howled in distant valleys, foxes barked near the edges of fields, and sometimes travelers swore they saw ghostly figures moving through the mist, perhaps spirits, perhaps memories of what the island had been. But fear gave way to habit. People learned to live with mystery. Theirs was a world measured in sounds, the crackle of wood, the soft lowing of cattle, the rhythm of raindrops on thatch. In such silence, thoughts became slow and deep. Without books or records, the mind filled its emptiness with imagination, shaping myths out of every ruin and meaning out of every star. And yet, even in this age of quiet survival, beauty persisted. On still mornings, the valleys glowed with dew, and the scent of wet earth mingled with wood smoke. The fields, though rough, shimmered gold in late summer, and the rivers moved like sheets of silver through the meadows. Children laughed, lovers met in secret, mothers sang softly as they ground grain, and in those fleeting moments, the weight of the world seemed lighter. To call this time dark is to misunderstand it. The darkness was not absence, but depth, a stillness in which the land itself was dreaming. Though no chronicler wrote their names, though no marble monument bore their likeness, the people of this forgotten Britain carried the quiet courage that would one day build kingdoms. They endured hunger, fear, and cold, but they also found joy in simple things: the warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, the glow of sunrise after a storm. They did not know they stood between worlds, between the old order fading and a new one not yet born. To them, history was not something written, but something lived. Each breath, each dawn, each season, a thread in the endless weave of time. Centuries later, scholars would call it the Dark Age, but for those who lived it, it was simply life, slow, patient, and filled with moments of quiet grace. In that dimness, where the empire's light had gone out and no new flame yet burned, Britain rested like a seed beneath the soil, gathering strength for the spring to come. The longer the centuries stretched, the quieter Britain became, as though the island itself were drawing a long breath between the age of Rome and the age of kings. The sound of Latin had long faded from the valleys, replaced by the mingling of rougher tongues, Celtic murmurs in the west, Saxon chants in the east, and Norse echoes from across the sea. Villagers rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, yet they carried within them the memory of lands they had never seen. They spoke of heroes who came from the sea, of lost gold buried under ruined temples, of spirits that guarded the ancient hills. Life was ordinary, yet full of wonder. Mornings began with the creak of wooden doors, the smell of smoke, and the call of roosters breaking the mist. Evenings ended with the hush of wind through trees, the crackle of fire, and the soft murmur of prayer. Everything moved in slow, natural rhythm, seed to harvest, birth to death, a world without haste, where the days felt eternal and history passed unseen. The people had little, yet they possessed the sky, the soil, and the endless company of one another. A shared loaf of bread was wealth, a sturdy roof was triumph, and a single dry winter was cause for gratitude. In that simplicity, the spirit of early Britain took shape, quiet strength, quiet sorrow, and quiet endurance. As small kingdoms grew bolder, stories began to take root in their shadows. Bards and storytellers, the guardians of memory, wandered from hall to hall, carrying with them songs of battle and loss, of love and betrayal. They sang of Arthur, the half-remembered warlord who had once united the Britons against the Saxons, of giants sleeping beneath the hills, of maidens turned to swans, of saints who calmed the seas with a whisper. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the heartbeat of a people who had no written past. To those who listened by the fire, such tales made sense of a harsh world. They gave meaning to suffering, purpose to patience, and light to darkness. No one knew which parts were true, but that hardly mattered. Truth was not measured in fact, but in feeling. The world beyond the village might have been uncertain, but within the ring of firelight, as voices rose and smoke curled toward the rafters, people felt anchored, part of a story far older than themselves. Across the island, traces of Rome still lingered like ghosts. Farmers plowed up fragments of pottery or stumbled upon crumbling stone walls, their fields whispering reminders of a vanished grandeur. In the north, abandoned fortresses dotted the wild frontiers, their gates yawning open to the wind. In the south, roads still stretched straight as memory, vanishing into bramble and fog. Sometimes a traveler would follow one for a day or two, only to find it ended in nothing but silence. The ruins were both warning and wonder, proof that greatness could fade, but also that time preserved what mattered. The people who lived among them did not envy the Romans. They pitied them, for what good was empire when it could not survive the rain and the grass? Their own lives, humble as they were, felt more real, woven into the heartbeat of the earth itself. The weather ruled everything. A long winter could destroy an entire generation. A wet spring could drown the crops. A dry summer could crack the soil and wither the grain. And yet, people endured. They learned to read the signs, the color of the sunset, the flight of birds, the whisper of wind through reeds. Nature was their calendar, their teacher, and sometimes their god. When storms broke over the coast, fishermen stayed ashore, crossing themselves or whispering old names to the waves. When the first frost glittered on the fields, shepherds lit small fires to bless their flocks. Even suffering became sacred, a ritual shared by all. There were no strangers, only neighbors bound by the same struggle. The world outside their valley might as well have been another planet. And perhaps that was what made life bearable, the smallness of it, the quiet certainty that their labor mattered, even if no one beyond the next hill would ever know their names. From the mist of those centuries, the first outlines of a new Britain began to form. Trade returned slowly along the old routes, merchants appearing with salt, iron, and stories from distant shores. The faint shimmer of coins re-entered the villages, though few cared much for them. Power began to concentrate again, strong men turning into lords, lords into kings. Wooden halls became centers of rule, and with rule came conflict, for no kingdom stays quiet for long. Yet even war in this age was different, small, personal, fought not for empire, but for honor and survival. After battle, men returned to their plows. After loss, women rebuilt what was broken. Life, as always, continued. Beneath the blood and ash, the soil remained faithful, and in its constancy lay the hope of generations. But there was another kind of growth, unseen, silent, spiritual. In monasteries, hidden among green hills, monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, their quills scratching like tiny insects in the dark. They wrote not just for their time, but for the future, preserving language, knowledge, and memory. Outside their walls, the world was rough and wild. Inside, time stood still. The smell of ink and beeswax filled the air, and through narrow windows they could see the gray morning unfolding. Their work was slow, repetitive, and exhausting. Yet in those endless lines of writing lay the fragile survival of civilization. The monks did not think of themselves as heroes, but they were quiet guardians of light in a world that often forgot it existed. Thanks to their patience, the names of kings, saints, and poets would one day rise again from the dust. And the dark would not remain forever. By the end of this long-forgotten age, Britain had changed, though no one living then could have seen it. The islands were still fragmented, but something invisible held them together now. A shared story, a slow awakening, the faint hum of identity. People began to think of themselves not just as tribes, but as part of a land with a single soul. The silence of centuries was breaking, replaced by the first chords of a new history. Soon the chroniclers would come, writing in Latin and Old English, turning memory into record. Soon the kings would rise, their crowns glinting like dawn, over a land that had almost forgotten what sunlight felt like. But before that day came, there was peace, a stillness unlike any other. The people of Dark Age Britain, poor and weary though they were, had built something enduring, a culture born from patience, faith, and the unspoken bond between earth and man. And when the winds swept across the moors at night, carrying the scent of rain and the echo of distant voices, it was as if the island itself whispered thanks to those who had kept its spirit alive through the long sleep of history. The longer the centuries stretched, the quieter Britain became. as though the island itself were drawing a long breath between the age of Rome and the age of kings. The sound of Latin had long faded from the valleys, replaced by the mingling of rougher tongues, Celtic murmurs in the west, Saxon chants in the east, and Norse echoes from across the sea. Villagers rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, yet they carried within them the memory of lands they had never seen. They spoke of heroes who came from the sea, of lost gold buried under ruined temples, of spirits that guarded the ancient hills. Life was ordinary, yet full of wonder. Mornings began with the creak of wooden doors, the smell of smoke, and the call of roosters breaking the mist. Evenings ended with the hush of wind through trees, the crackle of fire, and the soft murmur of prayer. Everything moved in slow, natural rhythm, seed to harvest, birth to death, a world without haste, where the days felt eternal and history passed unseen. The people had little, yet they possessed the sky, the soil, and the endless company of one another. A shared loaf of bread was wealth, a sturdy roof was triumph, and a single dry winter was cause for gratitude. In that simplicity, the spirit of early Britain took shape: quiet strength, quiet sorrow, and quiet endurance. As small kingdoms grew bolder, stories began to take root in their shadows. Bards and storytellers, the guardians of memory, wandered from hall to hall, carrying with them songs of battle and loss, of love and betrayal. They sang of Arthur, the half-remembered warlord who had once united the Britons against the Saxons, of giants sleeping beneath the hills, of maidens turned to swans, of saints who calmed the seas with a whisper. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the heartbeat of a people who had no written past. To those who listened by the fire, such tales made sense of a harsh world. They gave meaning to suffering, purpose to patience, and light to darkness. No one knew which parts were true, but that hardly mattered. Truth was not measured in fact, but in feeling. The world beyond the village might have been uncertain, but within the ring of firelight, as voices rose and smoke curled toward the rafters, people felt anchored, part of a story far older than themselves. Across the island, traces of Rome still lingered like ghosts. Farmers plowed up fragments of pottery or stumbled upon crumbling stone walls, their fields whispering reminders of a vanished grandeur. In the north, abandoned fortresses dotted the wild frontiers, their gates yawning open to the wind. In the south, roads still stretched straight. Sometimes a traveler would follow one for a day or two, only to find it ended in nothing but silence. The ruins were both warning and wonder, proof that greatness could fade. The people who lived among them did not envy the Romans. They pitied them, for what good was empire when it could not survive the rain and the grass? Their own lives, humble as they were, felt more real, woven into the heartbeat of the earth itself. The weather ruled everything. A long winter could destroy an entire generation. A wet spring could drown the crops. A dry summer could crack the soil and wither the grain. And yet, people endured. They learned to read the signs, the color of the sunset, the flight of birds, the whisper of wind through reeds. Nature was their calendar, their teacher, and sometimes their god. When storms broke over the coast, fishermen stayed ashore, crossing themselves or whispering old names to the waves. When the first frost glittered on the fields, shepherds lit small fires to bless their flocks. Even suffering became sacred, a ritual shared by all. There were no strangers, only neighbors bound by the same struggle. The world outside their valley might as well have been another planet. And perhaps that was what made life bearable, the smallness of it, the quiet certainty that their labor mattered, even if no one beyond the next hill would ever know their names. From the mist of those centuries, the first outlines of a new Britain began to form. Trade returned slowly along the old routes, merchants appearing with salt, iron, and stories from distant shores. The faint shimmer of coins re-entered the villages, though few cared much for them. Power began to concentrate again, strongmen turning into lords. Wooden halls became centers of rule, and with rule came conflict, for no kingdom stays quiet for long. Yet even war in this age was different, small, personal, fought not for empire, but for honor and survival. After battle, men returned to their plows. After loss, women rebuilt what was broken. Life, as always, continued. Beneath the blood and ash, the soil remained faithful, and in its constancy lay the hope of generations. But there was another kind of growth, unseen, silent, spiritual. In monasteries hidden among green hills, monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, their quills scratching like tiny insects in the dark. They wrote not just for their time, but for the future, preserving language, knowledge, and memory. Outside their walls, the world was rough and wild. Inside, time stood still. The smell of ink and beeswax filled the air, and through narrow windows they could see the gray morning unfolding. Their work was slow, repetitive, and exhausting. Yet, in those endless lines of writing lay the fragile survival of civilization. The monks did not think of themselves as heroes, but they were quiet guardians of light in a world that often forgot it existed. Thanks to their patience, the names of kings, saints, and poets would one day rise again from the dust, and the dark would not remain forever by the end of this long forgotten age. Britain had changed, though no one living then could have seen it. The islands were still fragmented, but something invisible held them together now. A shared story, a slow awakening, the faint hum of identity. People began to think of themselves not just as tribes, but as part of a land with a single soul. The silence of centuries was breaking, replaced by the first chords of a new history. Soon the chroniclers would come, writing in Latin and Old English, turning memory into record. Soon the kings would rise, their crowns glinting like dawn over a land that had almost forgotten what sunlight felt like. But before that day came, there was peace, a stillness unlike any other. The people of Dark Age Britain, poor and weary though they were, had built something enduring, a culture born from patience, faith, and the unspoken bond between earth and man. And when the winds swept across the moors at night, carrying the scent of rain and the echo of distant voices, it was as if the island itself whispered thanks to those who had kept its spirit alive through the long sleep of history. The rhythm of life in Dark Age Britain was slow and unhurried, yet beneath its quiet surface, forces of change moved like deep rivers under ice. Across valleys, moors, and windswept coasts, faith was knitting the fragments of a broken land back together. The monks who wandered through the mist were not warriors, yet they conquered hearts with patience and prayer. They carried no swords, only books, their pages heavy with ink and devotion. And through their hands, the memory of learning returned to Britain, like the first warmth after a long winter. In cold stone cells, they copied sacred texts by candlelight, each letter a whisper of hope against the darkness. The scratch of quills on parchment was the sound of civilization being reborn. On distant islands like Iona and Lindisfarne, small monasteries became lanterns of peace, their bells echoing across wild shores. They taught that even in a world of ruin, light could endure not the blinding light of empire, but the soft glow of faith, humility, and endurance. People began to measure their lives not by battles won, but by prayers spoken, not by the power of kings, but by the grace of saints. Yet faith was never simple, and in the silence of these early centuries, Britain's soul was torn between many paths. The old pagan ways still lingered in the woods, in the hearts of those who saw the sacred in stones and streams. Even as Christianity spread, many could not bear to abandon the ancient comfort of the earth's mysteries. And so the two faiths walked side by side, not in peace, but in reluctant companionship. A priest might bless a well, and villagers would still leave offerings at its edge. A cross might stand in a field once devoted to a harvest god, and no one would see contradiction. To live in those times was to balance between heaven and earth, between old fears and new hopes. In this strange harmony, something uniquely British was born, a spirituality rooted both in the soil and in the stars, both wild and holy, but faith alone could not quiet the hunger of kings. As the island's small kingdoms grew, so too did their ambitions. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. These were no longer just names whispered in smoky halls. They were powers rising like storms on the horizon. Each king sought to carve his legacy into the island's memory, to be more than a fleeting shadow in the mist. They built wooden halls filled with song and mead, gathered warriors bound by oaths of loyalty, and sent envoys bearing gifts of gold and iron. The age of chieftains was fading, and the first outlines of royal courts were forming. But such dreams were fragile, for Britain was still a land of many tongues and tempers. The Saxons ruled in the south, the Angles in the east. The Britons held to their highlands, and the Picts watched from the north, silent and fierce. The island was like a tapestry woven of 100 threads, beautiful, but always on the verge of unraveling, in the shadow of kings. Ordinary people lived lives that history would never remember. Theirs was the quiet endurance that kept the world turning. In small villages, surrounded by hedgerows and fields, life followed the pulse of the seasons. Spring brought plowing and planting. Summer, the long labor of growth. Autumn, the bittersweet harvest. And winter, the waiting. Families huddled by their hearths as storms rattled the shutters, telling stories of old heroes to keep fear at bay. Those stories, half memory, half myth, were the true inheritance of the Dark Ages. They gave meaning to hardship, hope to sorrow, and a sense that every life, however humble, was part of something larger. The bard and the monk shared a secret understanding that words could outlast stone, that memory was its own kind of kingdom. The landscape itself became a character in their story. Britain's forests were vast and ancient, filled with the scent of pine and moss, the cries of unseen creatures. The rivers glimmered like veins of silver through the hills, carrying both fish and fable. The mountains of the north stood as eternal witnesses, their peaks often lost in cloud. The people believed these places were alive, that the land watched and remembered. Even as kings drew lines on maps, the island refused to be tamed. Storms swept away crops, wolves hunted the edges of villages, and winters came with cruel indifference. Nature was both enemy and ally, feared, respected, never ignored. In its moods, the people saw reflections of their gods and of themselves, fierce, unpredictable, enduring. Trade slowly returned, and with it came whispers of the wider world. From across the channel came goods and ideas, silk from Byzantium, silver from the Franks, spices from distant coasts. The sea, once feared as a barrier, became a bridge. Coastal towns revived as ships came and went, their sails bright against the gray waves. With trade came curiosity, and with curiosity came change. Men who had once known only their village now dreamed of lands beyond the horizon. The monks, too, traveled, carrying faith and returning with knowledge. They brought new ways of building, new ways of writing, new ways of seeing. Britain, once isolated and forgotten, was quietly rejoining the rhythm of the world. And yet, beneath all this slow progress, there was always the shadow of violence. The peace of one generation could vanish in a single raid. Armies marched, torches burned, and the songs of victory were always followed by the silence of ruin. But the people were resilient. They rebuilt what was lost, again and again, their lives a cycle of destruction and renewal. They did not call it history, it was simply life. The old saying went that the earth remembers everything, and perhaps it did. Beneath every field where barley grew, bones slept, Roman, Saxon, Briton, all part of the same soil now. The island carried its past like a heartbeat beneath the surface. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, the pattern of life had settled into a fragile balance. Kings ruled their small realms, the church guided souls, and the people worked the land. Yet beneath the quiet, there was a stirring, the sense that something larger was coming. Britain was no longer a scattered archipelago of tribes and dreams. It was becoming a mosaic, every piece small but essential. The people did not know it yet, but their children's children would one day inherit a kingdom called England. For now, they lived in the in-between, between war and peace, between old gods and new, between memory and myth at dusk. When the fires burned low and the stars appeared, the world seemed to pause. A shepherd on the hillside might look across the valley and see the faint glow of another village miles away, and know that others too were watching the same sky. It was a small comfort in a vast, uncertain world. The sound of wind through the reeds, the distant bark of a dog, the crackle of the fire, these were the music of their nights. And in those quiet hours, as sleep crept over weary eyes, the people of Dark Age Britain dreamed not of conquest or glory, but of peace, a peace that always seemed just out of reach, yet worth dreaming of all the same. The kings and monks, the farmers and warriors, all played their part in the slow rebirth of a nation. Their names may be lost, their graves unmarked, but their lives were the soil from which Britain's future grew. Each prayer whispered in a chapel, each seed planted in a frozen field, each story told beside the fire, all of it became part of the great, unseen foundation of history. The Dark Ages were not truly dark. They were a time of waiting, of growing, of remembering. Like the long night before dawn, they held the promise of morning within them. And when the sun finally rose over Britain again, the world that emerged was not the same. It was wiser, humbler, and ready to begin anew. As the years folded into one another like pages in an endless book, Britain drifted through an age of quiet becoming, neither wholly wild nor wholly civilized, but somewhere in between, suspended in the gray mist of time. The chaos that had once reigned after Rome's fall was softening now into rhythm. Villages had grown into towns, and towns into the beginnings of small cities. Wooden halls stood where once there had been only ruins, and the hum of human life began to fill the empty spaces again. Across the green valleys, plumes of smoke rose into the morning sky, not from war, but from hearths, blacksmiths, and bread ovens. The land was no longer silent, it was breathing. The heartbeat of Britain had returned. People spoke of kings and saints with equal reverence, of battles won and miracles witnessed, as if both were part of the same divine story. History and myth were threads of one tapestry, each impossible to untangle from the other. In these centuries of slow transformation, the shape of identity began to form. The word English was not yet spoken, but its spirit was awakening. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, once fierce outsiders, now called this island home. Their children no longer remembered the voyage across the cold northern seas. They were born of this soil, baptized in its rivers, raised under its gray skies. The native Britons, though pushed to the edges, into the hills of Wales and the rugged lands of the West, carried with them an older magic, the poetry of a world before empire. Between these peoples, though war and sorrow lay deep, there was also an unspoken exchange of stories, of words, of ways of living. Out of conflict came culture, out of loss came legend. The island was weaving itself together, not by conquest, but by quiet inheritance. In the courts of kings, poets sang of lineage and destiny, their voices rising above the fire's crackle, their words echoing in wooden rafters. They told tales of heroes who never truly died, of swords that shone like stars, of queens whose beauty could calm the sea. The people listened, half believing, half dreaming, and in those moments, history became something sacred, a way to give meaning to hardship, to turn pain into memory, and memory into pride. The monks, too, wrote their chronicles, but their ink told of souls rather than swords. To them, the true battles were fought not on the field, but within the heart, between doubt and faith, sin and salvation. Thus, two kinds of truth grew side by side, one of kings and conquest, the other of spirit and silence. Together, they gave the island depth, the outer world of struggle and the inner world of prayer. Daily life remained a tapestry of simplicity. The people's days were shaped by the turning of the earth, by sunrise and sunset, by the coming of rain and frost. They worked not for riches, but for survival. Yet, in that humble rhythm lay a quiet wisdom. In the fields, the scent of soil and smoke mingled as oxen plowed the land. In the villages, the clatter of looms and the laughter of children carried through open doorways. Festivals marked the seasons, the lighting of fires at midwinter, the singing of harvest songs in autumn, the solemn prayers of Lent. Each event was a reminder that life was a circle. not a line that all things returned, changed yet familiar. Even in their hardship, the people found joy in bread fresh from the oven, in the warmth of shared mead, in the comfort of voices rising together against the long night. But Britain was never meant to be still for long. The wind that swept over its hills carried whispers of faraway shores, and with them came both promise and peril. Across the northern seas, eyes were turning toward the island, sharp eyes, hungry eyes. The Norsemen seafarers from the cold lands of Scandinavia began to stir. To them, Britain was a land of gold, of churches rich with silver and chalices, of fields ripe for taking. They built longships with dragon prows and sailed beneath the endless sky, guided by stars and fearless hearts. Their oars bit the waves like teeth, and soon their sails appeared on the horizon, the first shadow of the storm that would come to define an era. But in this moment of calm, before that storm, the people of Britain did not yet know the scale of what awaited them. They still believed their peace might last, their fragile kingdoms endure. It was the last deep breath before the wind changed forever. Still, even as danger gathered unseen, the spirit of the island grew stronger. The people had learned resilience through centuries of loss. They had buried empires, survived famine, endured invasions, and yet they remained. There was a kind of strength in their weariness, a strength born not of conquest, but of persistence. To be British in those times was to belong to the earth itself, to rise and fall with its seasons, to bend without breaking, to endure without glory. In this way, the land and its people were one. The cliffs of the coast stood like guardians against the sea. The forests whispered the songs of ancestors long gone. The rivers carried time itself, always moving, never ending. The island was not a kingdom yet, but it had a soul, ancient, restless, and enduring. In the monasteries, the monks continued their sacred work. Their quills danced across vellum, drawing letters shaped like prayers. They wrote of kings and saints, but also of storms, eclipses, and strange lights in the sky. To them, every event, no matter how small, was a sign of divine order. They saw history not as chance, but as a great, unfolding design. When lightning struck a tree, they marked it in their chronicles. When a comet blazed across the heavens, they saw it as prophecy. Theirs was a world of wonder where nothing was ordinary, and yet, in their quiet devotion, they preserved what might otherwise have been lost: knowledge, art, language, and the fragile thread of memory. Without them, the past would have vanished like mist. Because of them, it endured. As the centuries turned, small miracles continued to shape the island's destiny. A wounded soldier healed by faith, a lost village rebuilt from ashes, a forgotten child growing to be a king. These were the quiet seeds of legend. The line between real and unreal blurred so gently that even those who lived through it could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Perhaps that was the truest nature of the Dark Ages. Not darkness at all, but a twilight, a place where reality and myth walked hand in hand, where the world was both seen and unseen, and maybe in that in-between, the people of Britain found something deeper than history, a kind of peace in not needing to know everything, in simply existing as part of the great mystery of time. By the end of this age, Britain stood poised between past and future. Its people had survived the long night, and those storms would come again. They were ready in a way their ancestors had not been. The fires burned brighter now, the songs carried farther, and the stories were richer. They had turned endurance into culture, struggle into faith. The land that had once been divided by fear was slowly becoming united by identity. Not yet one nation, but one heart. And as dawn rose over the misty hills, the first light touched the spires of monasteries, the crowns of kings, and the fields of the common folk alike. The island that had slept through centuries of shadow was awake, watching the horizon, waiting for the next chapter of its long, impossible story to unfold. It began quietly, as most great storms do, with whispers before thunder. For generations, the people of Britain had lived in a fragile peace, a peace built from the ashes of forgotten wars and bound by the faith of weary hearts. The fields were green again, the rivers clean, and the bells of monasteries rang gently through the morning mist. Fishermen cast their nets, kings ruled their scattered lands, and monks copied their sacred books in silence. Life had found its rhythm once more, and for a while it seemed that the long darkness had passed. But across the sea, beyond the horizon, where the sky met the cold northern waters, something was stirring. There, in the hard lands of Norway and Denmark, where the wind howled through the fjords and snow lay thick upon the mountains, men were being shaped by hardship. They were seafarers, hunters and raiders, their lives carved by the ice and the waves. The sea was their road, their teacher, and their God. And when the hunger of their land grew too great, they turned their eyes toward the soft, green island that lay to the west. At first, they came as shadows. The old chronicles tell of a summer morning in the year 793, when the sea turned dark with sails nearly. The monks of the Holy Island saw them approach longships, gliding swift and silent, their carved dragon heads gleaming in the sun. At first, they thought them traitors, as the world had known for centuries. But the truth came with the clash of steel and the smell of burning wood. The raiders stormed the monastery, their axes flashing, their voices rising like thunder. They spared neither gold nor life. The sanctuary of peace was torn open, and for the first time in memory, the island of saints knew fear again. The chronicles say that great terror came upon the land of the English, and the people whispered that it was the punishment of God. But the truth was simpler. It was the turning of the tide, the start of an age that would reshape Britain forever. The Vikings, as they would come to be called, were not mere destroyers. They were seekers. Their raids were born of necessity as much as ambition, for their homeland could not feed them all. They followed the wind and the promise of new horizons. Their ships were marvels of craftsmanship, sleek, fast, and alive, as if carved from the bones of the sea itself. Each prow bore the head of a dragon or serpent, meant to frighten spirits and men alike. Beneath their decks, warriors sat shoulder to shoulder, their oars striking the water in perfect rhythm. They brought with them not just terror, but skill in metalwork, in trade, in the art of survival. Wherever they went, they changed the world. And Britain was no exception. The raids spread like ripples across the surface of the island's peace. Monasteries, once places of quiet prayer, became fortresses. The people learned to watch the horizon, to read the sky for omens. A red dawn meant danger. A strange light over the water meant ships might come. In villages near the coast, mothers whispered warnings to their children. Never trust the calm sea. Yet even in fear, the people adapted. Some fled inland to the safety of hills and forests. Others fortified their towns, raising wooden palisades and keeping watch through the night. Kings who had once fought each other now found a common enemy. For the first time, the idea of a united land and England began to flicker in the hearts of men. Adversity, as it often does, became the forge of identity. But the Vikings were more than raiders. Many came to trade, to settle, even to marry. In the north and east, they built towns that still bear their names. Places like York, once Eophoric, now York. Their language blended with that of the Saxons. Their customs mingled with the old. They brought new words for everyday things: sky, window, knife, husband. And in doing so, they shaped the very sound of English speech. Their gods, fierce and strange, met the saints of the island, and for a time both were worshipped side by side. A cross might stand beside a hammer of Thor, and no one thought it strange. The age of pure faith and simple borders was over. This was an age of mingling, of mixing blood and belief, of finding balance between war and peace. The kings of Britain rose to meet this challenge, some with wisdom, others with pride. Among them was Alfred of Wessex, a man born in the shadow of chaos, but destined to become its light. When the storm of the Northmen fell hardest upon the land, Alfred did not flee or yield. He hid in the marshes, gathered what strength he could, and struck back when the time was right. His victory at Edington turned the tide of despair into hope. He made peace not through fear, but through understanding, dividing the island between Saxon and Dane, creating the Danelaw, a fragile line between two worlds. Under his rule, learning returned, schools reopened, and the dream of unity took root. Alfred became more than a king. He became the symbol of resilience itself, the proof that even in the darkest hour, the light of thought and faith could survive. Life under Viking influence was hard but vibrant. Markets bustled again, filled with goods from across the seas: silk, amber, furs, and silver. Craftsmen forged weapons as beautifully as they forged jewelry. The art of storytelling flourished. Sagas of heroes, of sea voyages, and of doomed love echoed through mead halls. A sense of destiny filled the air, the feeling that every man's life was part of a greater story written by unseen hands. And though fear lingered at the edges, it was matched by wonder. The people of Britain, once simple and still, had become part of something vast, a world connected by trade, travel, and the restless hunger of the human spirit. For those who lived through it, the age was not romantic, but exhausting. Villages burned, families fled, kingdoms fell and rose again. The sea, which had once brought life and trade, became a symbol of dread. Yet, even in loss, something unbreakable endured. The people rebuilt as they always had. The monks returned to their ruined monasteries, raising new walls over old ashes. The farmers replanted their fields, their hands steady despite the memories of fire. The storytellers wove new legends from sorrow, turning tragedy into meaning. And slowly, painfully, the land healed. By the end of the 9th century, the island had changed beyond recognition. It was no longer a collection of tribes and kingdoms, but a mosaic of peoples: Saxon, Dane, Briton, and Norse, bound together by shared struggle. The blood of conquerors and conquered mingled in the earth, giving birth to a new people, neither holy one nor the other. The language they spoke was softer, rounder, richer, the beginnings of the English tongue we know today. And though they did not yet call themselves a nation, they felt it, that quiet, invisible bond of belonging to the same island, the same storms, the same story as the sun set over the hills of Wessex and the sea turned gold beneath the evening sky. An old monk might look out from his window and wonder at the strange mercy of time. So much had been lost, and yet so much had been gained. The ruins of the past had become the foundations of the future. The island that had once slept in darkness was alive with voices, with the clash of belief and the hum of creation. The wind that once carried only fear now carried song. And though the age of the Northmen was far from over, its legacy was already written in the hearts of the people. Britain had faced the sea and survived. And in surviving, it had become something new, a land tempered by fire, forged by faith, and forever restless beneath its gray and golden sky. Part 2. The Kingdoms That Would Not Die. As the years rolled on like the endless gray tides of the North Sea, Britain learned to live with the storm rather than against it. The raids that had once come like lightning now became part of the rhythm of life, feared, expected, and strangely ordinary. Along the coasts, where the gulls cried and the smell of salt clung to the air, people built their homes with an eye toward defense. Watchtowers rose above the cliffs. Men took turns keeping vigil through the night, their eyes scanning the dark horizon for the faint outline of a sail. The faintest ripple of oars against water could send whole villages running for the hills. Yet, between these moments of dread were long stretches of quiet living, of planting, of harvest, of prayer, of children born and elders buried. The people did not stop living. They simply learned to live with uncertainty, the way one learns to breathe through fear. The wind carried stories of far-off kings and great battles, but in the small corners of the island, life went on in its stubborn, humble way in the south, under the steady hand of Alfred. The dream of order began to take shape again. The Wessex court became not just a place of rule, but of renewal. Monks who had fled the burning monasteries returned with their precious books worn, singed, but still intact, and set about teaching a new generation of scribes and thinkers. Alfred's scholars wrote in both Latin and the tongue of the common folk, ensuring that the wisdom of old would not be lost to those who could not read the ancient languages. It was, in its quiet way, a revolution, a turning of the mind toward learning. After years, when the only sound had been the clash of steel and the cry of the dying, for the first time, the English language itself began to take form as something worth writing in, not just speaking. In that gentle shift from silence to script, a nation began to write its soul. But peace was never pure, not in that age. The Danelaw, that fragile border between the lands of the Saxons and the lands of the Danes, was a living wound, stitched together by treaties but always threatening to reopen. There were seasons when trade flourished between them, when markets buzzed with laughter and foreign goods, when men of both sides shared ale and stories. Yet there were other seasons when the old hatreds flared, when an insult at a feast or a raid gone too far reignited the fire. War returned, not as a storm, but as a slow, smoldering wind, creeping through fields and forests until it burned again. The border villages suffered most, their loyalties split, their homes often changing hands between kings they would never meet. For them, allegiance was a matter of survival, not pride. A farmer might bow to one lord in spring and another in winter, but his plow still turned the same earth. His children still slept beneath the same leaking roof. The politics of kings were grand and shifting, but the lives of ordinary people were bound to the soil, unchanging and eternal. In the north, the city of York, once Jorvik, became a jewel of Viking rule. The narrow streets filled with traders from far lands, Irish, Norse, Saxon, Frankish, even Byzantine. The smell of fish and spices mingled with the smoke of forges, the clang of hammers mixing with the chants of priests and the laughter of sailors. Here, in this strange crossroads of the world, cultures collided and blended in ways no king could have planned. Pagan temples stood beside Christian chapels. Norse sagas were told in taverns lit by the soft glow of beeswax candles. Women ran shops, foreigners held office, and silver coins, stamped with runes, changed hands in quiet markets. It was a city both ancient and new, the first glimpse of a cosmopolitan England, long before the word even existed. And though violence lurked in its shadows, Jorvik thrived as proof that even enemies could share a roof when survival demanded it. Far to the west, in Wales and the Highlands of Scotland, the old tribes endured in their own wild ways. They watched the Saxons and Danes tear at each other like wolves, and found in their struggle both danger and opportunity. The mountains sheltered them as they always had. Their kings were fierce and proud. Their poets kept the memory of heroes alive in song. To them, the battles of the lowlands were distant storms, loud but far away. Yet even they felt the pull of change. Traders brought northern silver to their markets, and foreign words began to seep into their speech. The island was slowly knitting itself together, not through peace, but through the constant crossing of blood and story. And through it all, religion remained the thread that bound the weary hearts of the people. In monasteries rebuilt from ashes, monks sang the old hymns again, their voices rising through cold stone halls. Pilgrims traveled from holy site to holy site, seeking miracles, forgiveness, or simply a sense of belonging in a world too large to understand. Yet, beneath the Christian faith that spread across the island, the old beliefs lingered. In quiet villages, charms were still hung over doors to ward off spirits. Farmers still whispered to the land before planting, and sailors still offered a prayer to the sea before setting sail. The merging of these worlds, of cross and rune, of Christ and Woden, gave Britain its strange, haunting beauty. It was a land of contradictions, devout yet superstitious, war-torn yet peaceful in its dreams, broken yet always rebuilding by the 10th century. A strange stability had begun to settle. The sons of Alfred continued his work, building alliances through marriage, treaty, and war. Towns became more than refuges. They became centers of craft, law, and trade. The first stone churches rose beside wooden halls, their bells marking the passage of time in a land that had known too many timeless nights. Roads were repaired, bridges built, markets established under royal charter. A sense of governance, fragile but real, began to spread. It was not yet the England of kings and parliaments, But it was the beginning of the idea that a land could belong to more than just its rulers. It could belong to its people. Still, the shadow of the sea never left. Each generation grew up with stories of ships that might come again, of strangers whose sails would appear like ghosts on the horizon. And indeed, they did come again. Not just Vikings, but traders from beyond, messengers, pilgrims, wanderers. Britain's isolation had ended forever. The same waters that had once brought terror now brought connection. The people who had once prayed for calm seas now depended on them. The sea had taken its toll, but it had also given the island something precious: resilience, a knowledge that life was fragile, but that fragility could be turned into strength if held with patience and faith. As winter fell across the land, and the fires burned low in the hearths of small homes, storytellers would speak of the old days, of the first ships that came, of the kings who rose to defend their people, of the lands divided and joined again. Children would listen with wide eyes, their imaginations filled with dragons, saints, and warriors. But as they drifted into sleep, the world outside would be quiet, the snow falling softly over fields where once armies had marched. And perhaps, in that silence, their dreams carried not the sound of war, but the hum of peace, fragile, fleeting, but finally, wonderfully real. For the land was healing, as land always does. The scars of the Northmen remained, carved into stone, language, and blood. But so too did their gifts, the courage to endure, the art of the shipwright, the stories of gods who walked among men. The old age was ending, and a new one was waiting beyond the horizon, ready to unfold with the slow grace of dawn. And though no one alive then could see it, the centuries of pain and mingling and survival were shaping something extraordinary. A people who would one day call themselves English, and a land that would remember every shadow it had ever walked through. By the time the 11th century dawned, the winds that had once howled across Britain had grown gentler, as though the sea itself were tired of fighting. The land was quieter now, not because peace had triumphed completely, but because the endless struggle had settled into rhythm, the rhythm of life itself. The people had learned to live with change, to carry memory without being crushed by it. The villages that had been burned were rebuilt in the same places, the same stones reused, the same prayers whispered over new foundations. In those rebuilt homes, children grew up hearing the tales of the Northmen, not as nightmares, but as distant legends, stories of a time when gods and men had walked the same earth. They listened with wonder, not fear. The terror of the past had softened into history, and history, as it always does, became something comforting once enough time had passed. The kings of England, for by then, it truly was, England now ruled with cautious pride. Alfred's dream had come true, though he had not lived to see it. The patchwork of kingdoms and tribes had been woven together into something resembling unity. Yet even unity in that age was fragile, like frost on morning grass, beautiful, temporary, and easily shattered. The Danes who had once raided now governed as part of the land. Their children spoke both tongues, prayed to both gods, and called both England and Scandinavia home. The court at Winchester echoed with the sound of mixed accents, the clinking of foreign coins, the hum of scribes and messengers. Trade routes stretched farther than ever, to Normandy, to Ireland, to the far shores of the Baltic. The island was no longer a closed world. It was a crossroads of many. Yet in the midst of this new order, the old restlessness still lingered. Power, as it always does, drew those who hungered for more. The Northmen who had once come as raiders now came as kings. The greatest of them was Canute, the Danish prince, who would rule not just England but Denmark and Norway as well, binding 3 crowns under one seaborne hand. To many, his reign seemed a strange twist of fate, that the descendants of those who had burned the land would one day rule it in peace. But Canute was no barbarian. He built churches, honored English law, and married into the royal line. Under his rule, England prospered as it had not done in generations. Ships brought goods from every corner of the known world, and scholars wrote of a new golden age of learning and faith. The monasteries thrived again, their libraries filled with books copied by careful hands under the soft glow of candlelight. It was as though the land, long battered by storms, had at last found a moment of calm between tempests. But even golden ages carry shadows. When Canute died, his empire unraveled like a sail cut loose in a sudden gust. Rival kings rose and fell in quick succession, their reigns brief and bloody. The English crown passed from hand to hand, the old rivalries stirring once more beneath the surface. And in the distance, across the narrow sea, new eyes watched Norman eyes, sharp and patient. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne by blood and by right, and his gaze was fixed firmly upon the island that had once resisted so many invaders. The year 1066 would come like thunder, a final echo of the ancient storms that had shaped the land for centuries. But that, Johnny, is another story, the story of how one age ended and another began, of how the last breath of the Dark Ages gave way to the first dawn of something new. For now, in this moment, the story rests on the edge of calm. The people of Britain, weary but unbroken, lived between past and future. The monks continued their endless work of writing, preserving, and praying. Farmers sowed their fields with quiet determination, their hands rough, their faith simple. Children laughed in the courtyards of new stone churches, chasing each other through the long shadows of the towers. The sound of hammers echoed from smithies, of markets from town squares, of bells from distant abbeys. Life was no longer about survival alone. It was about rebuilding meaning. The ghosts of the past, the raiders, the fallen kings, the saints, lingered in memory, but they no longer ruled it. They had become part of the soil itself, part of the air that filled every breath. And yet, when night came and the wind rose over the moors, the old fears returned in whispers. The sea still sang its cold, ancient song. Some said they could still hear the oars of the longships in the distance, the faint creak of wood and rope beneath the moonlight. But perhaps that was only memory carried in the blood. The people no longer trembled at the sound. They listened, instead, with a kind of reverence, for it was the sound that had shaped them. Without the raids, the wars, the mingling of cultures, they would not be who they were. The storm had not destroyed them. It had carved them into something stronger. The Dark Ages, so often called dark by those who came after, were not without their light. It was the light of hearths in small cottages, of candles in monasteries, of dawns over fields, sown anew after every war. It was a quiet light, soft, flickering, but enduring. In those centuries of struggle, Britain learned a lesson that would echo through its history, that no power, no empire, no storm lasts forever. All things pass, kingdoms, faiths, fears, but the spirit of a people endures when it learns to adapt. That, more than anything, was the true legacy of the age. As the stars filled the cold night sky, the island seemed to rest at last. The waves brushed softly against its shores, the forests whispered with the wind, and the villages slept beneath a silver moon. Time itself seemed to slow, as if catching its breath after centuries of chaos. The dark ages were ending, though no one alive knew it yet. The world beyond Britain was changing, empires rising again, cities glowing with learning, ships setting sail to far continents. But for those who slept that night in the cottages and castles of England, the only sound was the sea, eternal, patient, and calm. Perhaps that is how history truly moves, not in noise or battle, but in silence, in the soft turning of a page, the rebuilding of a home, the whisper of a lullaby passed from mother to child. The great storms fade, but life remains, endlessly repeating its gentle rituals. And so the people of Britain, who had once lived in the shadow of endless invasion, now lived in the peace of endurance. Their hearts carried the memory of darkness, but also the warmth of dawn. The age of swords was not yet over, but the age of hope had begun. And as the mist rose over the hills of Wessex, as monks lit their morning fires and fishermen cast their nets into the cold gray sea, the island stood quiet, strong, scarred, and beautiful. The north wind had come and gone. The long night had passed, and somewhere in that stillness, history itself seemed to close its eyes, breathe deeply, and drift, finally, into sleep. The 11th century unfolded slowly, like mist creeping over an old battlefield, softening the scars of what had been. Britain, once torn by endless raids and rival kings, now seemed to breathe again, its heart beating not with fear, but with a weary calm. Villages that had been burned and rebuilt 100 times began to stand longer. Their walls of timber and stone grew sturdier, their fields greener, their people more hopeful. The roads that had once been broken by war were mended, not for armies, but for merchants and pilgrims. The sound of hooves and wheels replaced the echo of battle cries, and the markets swelled with the chatter of trade, wool from the north, grain from the south, silver from the east, and spices from lands most had never seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, the island's stories were not of war, but of work. Men and women spoke of crops, of weather, of prices, of children, small things that in their quiet way meant peace had truly taken root. Yet peace in those days was not silence, but a careful balance. The memory of the Northmen lingered in every coastal village, in the faces of their descendants, in the words people still spoke without thinking. English had become a living tapestry of sounds, part Saxon, part Norse, part Latin, all bound by the rhythm of the people. Words like sky, egg, window, law, husband had come from the tongues of the raiders, now as natural as the air itself. Even the way people prayed had changed. In the churches, the Latin chants of monks mixed with the English of farmers kneeling in the pews. The old pagan symbols had long been buried, yet their echoes remained in carvings of dragons on church doors. in the festivals that still marked the seasons, in the quiet reverence for the land itself. Christianity had triumphed, yes, but it had done so not by destroying the old ways, but by absorbing them, reshaping them into something uniquely English, a faith both gentle and practical. As weathered as the stones it was preached from, the kings who ruled after Canute carried the weight of this fragile balance. Some were wise, others reckless, but all understood that the crown was no longer a prize of conquest. It was a burden of stewardship. King Edward, whom the people would one day call the Confessor, was among the strangest of them. Born half Norman, half English, he was a man of peace in an age that still worshipped war. He loved prayer more than battle, the sound of bells more than the ring of swords. Under his rule, England was calm, but beneath the calm, the winds of ambition were gathering once more. Norman lords held power in his court. Their tongues, their customs, and their ambitions crept quietly into English life. In the halls of Westminster, where stone arches rose above polished floors, one could hear both languages spoken, the soft rhythm of English and the clipped syllables of French. It was a foreshadowing, though no one yet knew it, of a storm that would soon rise again from across the sea. For the common folk, however, such politics meant little. Their world was the land, the plow, the field, the church, the seasons. A year was measured not in royal decrees, but in harvests. Spring meant hope, summer meant work, autumn meant gratitude, and winter meant endurance. The days began with the tolling of bells and ended with the glow of hearths. Children learned from their parents, not from books. Knowledge passed through hands, not ink. The rhythm of life was ancient, older than kings, older even than memory. And yet, in that simplicity, something profound endured, a kind of quiet faith in the ordinary. For after centuries of chaos, the people had come to see peace not as the absence of war, but as the presence of small joys, a full storehouse, a healthy child, a good harvest, a Sunday without fear. Still, the nobility lived in another world entirely, a world of castles, banners, and shifting loyalties. Stone fortresses began to rise across the land, replacing the old wooden halls. They stood like gray teeth against the sky, symbols of both protection and power. Within their walls, lords held feasts that glittered with wealth, roasted meats, music, and wine from France. But outside, the peasants who worked their lands still lived humbly, their lives bound by the soil and the seasons. Yet even here, there was a strange harmony. The feudal bond, harsh though it was, tied everyone together in a web of duty. The lord owed protection. The peasant owed labor. The church stood between them both, reminding each of their place in the divine order. It was a system that could not last forever, but for now it held. It gave the island something it had not known for centuries: structure, stability, and the illusion, however fragile, of permanence. Beyond the walls of England, the world was stirring. To the north, in Scotland, new kings were rising, uniting the wild highlands under a single crown. To the west, in Wales, the ancient Cymry clung to their independence, their poets singing songs of defiance and memory. To the east, across the sea, Normandy grew powerful, its dukes ambitious, its knights restless. The sea that had once separated England from danger was now becoming a bridge again, a path for new ambitions, new invasions, new dreams. but within England's borders, for a brief and precious time, the people lived as if the world might never change again. Monasteries flourished once more. Their libraries swelled with books, some copied by English monks, others brought from the continent. The art of illumination reached new heights. Pages of scripture glowed with gold leaf and blue pigment, their letters curling like vines. In the evenings, the monks walked through their cloisters in silence, the sound of their sandals on stone echoing softly beneath the stars. They prayed not for glory or power, but for balance, that the fragile peace might endure, that the sins of the past might stay buried, the world outside their walls might rise and fall, but inside, time seemed to move slower, as if even history itself bowed before their discipline. And though the people of England could not see it then, they stood on the edge of another great turning. The peace of Edward's reign was a deep breath before the plunge. Across the Channel, William of Normandy was watching, waiting, preparing. He had already claimed his right to the English throne, a promise made, he said, by Edward himself. In the taverns and marketplaces, rumors spread like wildfire that when the old king died without an heir, the Normans would come. The thought brought a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Some feared the return of invasion, others hoped for new fortune. But most, in their quiet villages, simply shrugged and went on with their work. Kings and crowns might change, but the land remained. Wheat still needed to be sown, bread still needed to be baked, and prayers still needed to be said at dawn. And so, under gray skies and gentle rains, the last calm years of the old England passed. The monasteries kept their bells, the fields kept their seasons, the people kept their stories. They did not know that soon the very language they spoke, the customs they cherished, even the laws they followed would be transformed by foreign rule. They did not know that the Norman conquest would change not just kings, but the soul of the island itself. For now, all they knew was the quiet, a quiet, hard-earned, and deeply loved. It was the silence before the storm, yes, but it was also something more, the sound of a people at peace with their past, however brief that peace might be. And if, on some nights, the wind blew across the fields with a sound like distant waves, the people did not fear it. They knew its song. It was the voice of the north wind. Tamed, but not forgotten, the same wind that had brought destruction and change, now carrying whispers of what was to come. The world was turning again, as it always did, but for this moment, in this soft twilight between ages, England slept beneath its quiet crown, dreaming of tomorrow. By the time the 7th century dawned upon Britain, the island had begun to stir from its long half-sleep, as if some hidden current beneath the soil had started to hum again, softly at first, then with a growing pulse that touched even the quietest valleys. The dark age was still dark, the nights still long and cold, but faint sparks of change began to glimmer across the gray land. Traders once again crossed the seas, bringing salt and cloth, beads of glass, tiny mirrors that caught the light like trapped stars. Monks with strange accents arrived from distant places, from Ireland, from Gaul, from the far northern isles, carrying with them not swords, but books bound in worn leather, pages filled with curling lines and mysterious symbols. To the villagers, these men seemed like magicians of peace. They spoke gently, their eyes calm, their hands ink-stained, and they built small monasteries from wood and stone in lonely clearings by rivers. Around these places of prayer, the air itself felt changed. Bells rang in the morning mist, their clear tones drifting over fields and through the trees, calling no army, demanding no tribute, only silence and reflection for the people. These new voices brought both wonder and confusion. Some called the monks holy men, others feared them as bringers of strange customs that might anger the old gods. Yet the monks did not fight the old beliefs. They absorbed them, slowly, quietly, the way water softens stone. They spoke of one God, but they honored the rhythms of the seasons, and their prayers often mingled with the songs of farmers. In spring, they blessed the seeds. In harvest, they blessed the grain. In winter, they prayed for light to return. Thus, Christianity took root not through conquest, but through patience, sinking into the hearts of those who had always looked to the sky for answers. In their small scriptoria, the monks copied the words of forgotten sages, preserving fragments of knowledge that might have vanished forever. Roman histories, Celtic tales, prayers from the desert. They painted the first illuminated letters, gold and blue and green, glowing like jewels against the pale parchment. Symbols of light within the darkness. Around these growing centers of faith, new settlements appeared. Villages sent their sons to learn letters, to read the strange marks that turned sound into thought. A few young minds, touched by curiosity, discovered the joy of words, and through them the world widened. To write was to reach beyond one's lifetime, to speak to the future. And for the first time in centuries, the people of Britain began to sense themselves as part of a story again. Still, life remained harsh. Winters killed, as they always had. Hunger stalked the weak. Raiders came from the sea, their longboats cutting through the mist like dark blades. Yet there was something new in how people faced such trials. Not merely endurance, but a faint, steady hope that there was meaning even in suffering. Faith had planted the seed of purpose, and though the soil was rough, it began to grow. The land itself bore witness to this slow rebirth. Where old Roman ruins still stood, the stones were taken and reused, not to rebuild empire, but to shape small churches whose walls echoed with chant instead of command. In these humble halls, light filtered through narrow slits, striking the faces of those who knelt in prayer. Candles flickered beside rough-hewn altars, and the smell of beeswax and wet wool filled the air. Outside, graves were marked not with idols or carvings of beasts, but with simple crosses of wood. Death remained near, but it was no longer feared in the same way. The promise of heaven softened its edges, turning sorrow into something almost gentle. And as faith spread, so did story. The monks who traveled the countryside carried not only scripture but tales, stories of saints who tamed wolves, of holy wells that cured sickness, of angels who walked in disguise through lonely roads. In these stories, the people found echoes of their own old myths. The saints resembled heroes of the forest. The angels carried the mystery of ancient spirits. Thus, the new world and the old merged, weaving a tapestry that was neither pagan nor wholly Christian, but something uniquely British, a faith born of fog and firelight, of sorrow and endurance. The people began to see holiness in ordinary things, the turning of the plow, the glow of sunrise through smoke, the cry of a newborn. Every act of survival became an act of devotion. Yet, even as peace slowly took root, the island remained fragile. Kingdoms were forming: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, each ruled by men who dreamed of power but ruled by chance. Wars flared like sudden sparks, brief and brutal. Villages burned, harvests were stolen, families scattered. But the monks kept writing, the farmers kept sowing, and the mothers kept singing to their children. That was the true strength of Dark Age Britain, not its warriors, but its persistence. Like the ancient oaks that bent in storm but never broke, the people held fast by the rivers where mist curled low at dawn. Fishermen cast their nets and spoke in the soft accents of many tribes. Their words mixed Latin with Saxon, Celtic with Norse, a language still forming, rough but alive. It was in these mingled tongues that the future English was being born. Not in courts, but in cottages, not in palaces, but in fields. Words that once belonged to conquerors were reshaped by the mouths of peasants until they belonged to everyone. The island was learning to speak again, and so the so-called Dark Age glowed faintly with light, not bright, not grand, but human and enduring. It was the light of a candle in a storm, small yet stubborn. It burned in the hearts of monks who copied lines by moonlight, in the hands of mothers who patched cloaks for their children, in the songs of shepherds echoing across empty hills. In those quiet acts lay the beginning of a civilization that would one day call itself England. The age did not end in battle or decree. It ended in silence, in the slow gathering of faith, language, and memory that turned darkness into dawn. And though centuries would pass, though kings would rise and fall, and the world would change beyond recognition, the echo of those first bells ringing through the morning fog would never quite fade. They still seemed to linger in the landscape, in the ruined abbeys and green fields where sheep now graze, in the rhythm of old stone walls, in the hush before rain. If one stands still enough, breath held, heart quiet, one might almost hear them, those faint, patient notes calling across time, reminding us that even in the darkest age, light was never truly gone. By the time the 8th century stretched its quiet hand over Britain, the land had become something new, still rough, still scarred, but alive in a way it had not been for centuries. The ruins of Rome were now part of the landscape, softened by moss and memory. The forests had grown wilder, the rivers slower, the people wiser in their quiet endurance. Across the island, small communities pulsed like faint stars, scattered through darkness: monasteries, market towns, farming villages, each carrying its own fragile light. The world was still uncertain, yet there was a calm in that uncertainty, as though the island had finally accepted its place between shadow and dawn. The people no longer looked backward to what was lost, nor forward to what might come. They had learned to live within the moment, between sowing and reaping, between winter's chill and summer's brief sweetness. It was in this balance that Dark Age Britain found its strange kind of peace. The monks who had once arrived as wanderers were now part of the land's rhythm. Their bells marked the hours, rising and falling with the wind, calling shepherds in the distance and echoing through the fog like voices from another world. Within their stone walls, they copied and sang, prayed and planted, turning faith into a daily craft. Some monasteries became centers of quiet brilliance, places like Lindisfarne and Iona, where words glowed like light on water. They wrote the Gospels in inks of lapis and gold, blending art and devotion until each letter seemed to breathe. To the villagers who glimpsed these manuscripts, they were treasures beyond imagining, shimmering worlds trapped within pages. But to the monks, they were gifts for God, offerings shaped by patience, not pride. Outside, the peasants tended their fields, as always, the rhythm of labor unchanged. The plow creaked through wet soil, the seed fell, the birds sang, the year turned. Yet even the simplest worker, hearing the distant bell or glimpsing a carved cross by the road, felt part of something greater, not empire, not kingdom, but faith, quiet and enduring, still. Beyond the gentle hum of daily life, shadows gathered on the sea. From the north came rumors of dragon-proud ships, of men who worshipped strange gods and carried fire wherever they went. The first raids came like storms, sudden, brutal, gone before anyone could resist. Monasteries, those fragile islands of peace, were the first to suffer. The raiders came at dawn, the light still pale on the water, their oars cutting the mist. They took what they could, gold, cattle, men, and left behind ruin. Yet even in this violence, the island endured. The monks rebuilt, prayed again, wrote again. Villagers hid their few treasures, then returned to their fields. Fear became another thread in the tapestry of life, woven beside faith and hunger and hope. It was as if the people had learned that no darkness was final, that the world, like the seasons, would always turn again, and so it did. Kings rose, ruled, and vanished. Borders shifted like sand. Languages mingled further, the rough Saxon guttural blending with the smooth Latin and the soft remnants of the Celtic tongue, until a new voice began to form, a voice that would one day be called English. It was not born in courts, but in cottages, not written first in law, but spoken by the fire, by mothers soothing children and farmers calling across fields. Out of hardship, the land was shaping a language that would outlive all its kings. Even the old gods, though pushed to the edges of memory, never fully left. Their whispers lingered in the forests, in the standing stones, in the old festivals where fire still burned to mark the turning of the year. Christianity had triumphed, but the ancient world still breathed beneath its surface. And perhaps it was that blend, that meeting of sacred and wild, that gave Britain its soul. As the centuries turned, light began to gather, not the blinding light of empire, but the soft glow of a dawn breaking slowly over a patient land. New songs were written, new prayers sung. Scholars traveled once more between kingdoms. Craftsmen shaped stone into arches that reached toward heaven. The island, once silent, was beginning to sing again. And yet, if one walked the lonely hills at dusk, the feeling of the old age lingered. The wind still carried the scent of wood smoke and wet grass, and in the distance, the shape of an old Roman wall might appear through the fog, like the ghost of a forgotten time. In that moment, the past and present seemed to exist together, the echo of legions fading into the chant of monks, the whisper of pagan prayers blending with church bells. It was a harmony made of centuries, quiet and eternal. Life in those days remained humble. A child's laughter, the clatter of a wooden cart, the bark of a dog by a stream. These were the sounds of the world. Men still rose before dawn, hands cracked from cold, to work the same earth their fathers had worked. Women still wove, cooked, and sang, their songs older than memory. But now, in the corner of some huts, a small wooden cross might hang. In others, a simple book, copied by a monk, might rest, filled with symbols that only a few could read. To those who could, reading was like touching another mind across time, a miracle greater than magic. Through such fragile beginnings, learning returned, like a trickle of light beneath a closed door. The Dark Age was ending, though no one living then would have known it. To them, it was just life, ordinary, hard, and sacred in its simplicity. When night fell, it fell as it always had, vast and complete. The stars were cold, the hearths warm. People slept to the sound of wind and distant waves, dreaming of things both ancient and eternal. Perhaps they dreamed of the sea, of the forests, of the bells that rang across the island's sleeping body. Perhaps they dreamed of peace, and perhaps, without knowing it, they dreamed us the future that would one day look back and call their world dark. Yet, in truth, it was not darkness they lived in, but a kind of dusk before dawn, a deep and necessary quiet before the noise of history began again. They gave us the roots of language, the bones of faith, the endurance of the heart. Without their stillness, our light would never have come. So when we speak of the Dark Ages, perhaps we should whisper, not shout, for those who lived then did not dwell in darkness, but in patience. They built not with marble, but with endurance, not with armies, but with prayer and persistence. And in the end, it was they who carried the fragile light of civilization across the centuries. Hidden in their hearts, in their songs, in their faith, Britain rose from their silence, and from that silence came a new world. The bells kept ringing, the plows kept turning, and the dawn kept creeping through the mist, slow, soft, unstoppable. By the 9th century, the island of Britain stood at the edge of something new. The long centuries of silence had softened its shape, smoothed its roughness, and prepared it for the slow awakening of history. The fields that once lay abandoned were now patterned with life, narrow strips of grain waving in the wind, sheep moving like pale clouds across the hills, smoke curling gently from the chimneys of wooden halls. The sound of bells mingled with the lowing of cattle, the creak of carts, the laughter of children running barefoot through the mud. To an outsider, it might have seemed humble, small, even poor, but to those who lived it, this was the pulse of the world, simple, steady, alive. They did not think of themselves as living after an empire or before a nation. They lived within the turning of the earth, within the breath of their own brief seasons. The Romans were long gone. The Saxons had come and settled. The old Britons lingered in the west and north, and out of their mingling had grown something new, a land no longer broken, but slowly knitting itself together, thread by thread, name by name. In this age, kings were fewer in number, but greater in ambition. They were not emperors of marble halls, but warlords of timber and earth, men who ruled as much through oaths as through armies. Their courts were smoky places filled with the scent of meat and mead, with the sound of songs sung by bards who carried memory instead of books. In those songs, the world was shaped anew each night. Heroes of old walked again. Monsters fell beneath shining blades. and the deeds of the past became the dreams of the present. The people listened, not for entertainment, but for belonging, for the reassurance that their small, uncertain lives were part of something vast and continuing. Every tale told by firelight was a bridge across centuries, binding the living to the dead. The monasteries still glowed like quiet stars, but now they were joined by market towns, where traders from distant shores brought salt, amber, and fine cloth. On feast days, the fields around these towns filled with colored tents of bright fabric, wagons heavy with goods, voices shouting in many tongues. Coins passed from hand to hand, though barter still ruled most exchanges. And yet, among the noise, there was always the echo of faith, a bell ringing from a church, a monk's chant rising above the crowd, reminding all who heard that the world was still watched by unseen eyes. Learning began to move again, carried in saddlebags and in the minds of wandering scholars. They spoke of stars, of medicine, of the ways of the ancients. In their words, the memory of the classical world flickered faintly, not as command, but as whisper. The Dark Age had not erased knowledge. It had merely hidden it, keeping it safe until the world was ready to listen again. But beyond all these small awakenings, there remained the sea, that great and restless presence. It gave life through fish and trade, and it took life through storms and war. Upon it came danger once more. The Northmen, fierce and hungry, whose ships moved like shadows across the waves. Their raids were merciless, their gods alien, their courage terrible. Yet even they, in time, became part of the island's story. Some stayed, built homes, married, and sowed fields beside the very people they had once attacked. The blood of raider and farmer mixed, and the island absorbed them as it had absorbed so many before. Britain's strength was not in purity, but in its ability to endure, to bend without breaking, to gather all that touched it into the slow, steady fabric of itself. The people lived close to the earth still. They marked their time by the sowing and the harvest, by the coming of lambs, by the frost that bit their fingers in January. They still feared hunger and disease, but they faced them with the same quiet patience their ancestors had carried through the centuries. Their homes were small but warm, their food plain but shared. On long winter nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, families would huddle close and listen to the oldest among them speak of saints and spirits, of kings and miracles, of lands beyond the sea. To the children, these stories were not history, but truth, alive and breathing in the darkness. The Dark Age had become a living myth, a dream passed down through voices and memory, until even hardship took on the glow of legend. Faith had deepened to churches now stood not just in monasteries, but in villages, their wooden towers rising above the roofs like sentinels. The cross had become as common as the plow, a sign of hope carved on doorframes, worn around necks, painted on shields. But beneath the prayers and hymns, the old reverence for nature endured. When a storm came, people still looked to the trees and streams with awe. When a child was born, they still whispered blessings, older than Scripture. Christianity had not erased the old ways. It had clothed them in new words, giving divine form to what had always been sacred. The people's faith was not dogma, but a living rhythm, born of wind, rain, and soil. And in that rhythm, there was beauty. The mornings were pale and cold, the air full of birdsong and smoke. The afternoons shimmered with golden light over wet meadows. At dusk, when the sky turned to violet and the first stars appeared, the world seemed to pause. It was in those quiet hours that the island revealed its soul, not in its kings or battles, but in the stillness of its hills, the patience of its rivers, the endurance of its people. For them, life was not about conquest, but continuity, not glory, but survival. And in that survival was greatness. It is easy, centuries later, to call their world dark, to see only the ruins, the silence, the absence of grandeur. But within that silence, something essential was being forged: humility, faith, resilience. The people of the Dark Ages built not towers of stone, but foundations of spirit. They learned to live with less and still find meaning. They learned that light need not be blinding to be real. Their world was slower, smaller, harder, but it was also fuller, richer, closer to the pulse of the earth. They had no histories, but they had stories. No science, but they had wonder. No peace that lasted, but a hope that never died. So when the light of the next age finally came, when kings like Alfred would rise, when books would spread again, when nations would begin to take shape, it was not the start of something new, but the blooming of something ancient. The roots had been laid in silence, in the long patience of forgotten centuries. The Dark Age was not an ending, but a womb, and from its depths, the future was being born. By the time the 10th century began to whisper across the hills of Britain, the island seemed almost at peace, though that peace was never still, never certain, always moving like mist across the valleys. The people had learned to live between light and shadow, between memory and becoming. Beneath the soil lay centuries of forgotten bones: Roman soldiers, Celtic chieftains, Saxon farmers, monks who had copied prayers until their eyes failed, and above that earth walked their descendants, carrying the same rhythm of breath, the same hunger, the same fragile hope. Every footstep on a muddy path was a kind of echo, a conversation with the past that no one could hear, but everyone somehow felt. The fields were wider now, the villages tighter, the roads clearer, though many still wandered like threads through the wild woods. Along these paths traveled merchants, priests, and pilgrims, their lives woven into the endless murmur of the island. Some carried relics of saints, others bundles of wool or jars of honey, and some carried only stories which were worth more than either gold or grain. For in those stories the people kept their truth, that no darkness lasts forever, that every winter carries the promise of spring. In the monasteries, where stone walls replaced the old timber halls, the hum of prayer never ceased. The monks, wrapped in rough wool habits, bent over their manuscripts like gardeners tending small, bright gardens. They mixed their ink with soot and wine, and on pages of stretched calfskin, they painted letters that seemed to glow even in the dim candlelight. Every stroke was a quiet defiance against the forgetting of the world. Outside their cloisters, kings rose and fell, armies clashed, villages burned. Yet inside, the patient sound of quills continued, steady as heartbeats. Some wrote in Latin, others dared to write in the new English tongue, giving shape to a language that would one day fill libraries and stages and songs. To them, the world was not dark, but alive with meaning, each word a spark that refused to go out. Yet even among the monks there was fear, fear of the sea, fear of the Northmen who still prowled the coasts, fear of famine and plague. These were not simple superstitions, but the realities of fragile life. When the crops failed, when the sky turned strange colors, people looked to the heavens for signs. A comet might be a message, a rainbow, a warning, thunder, the voice of God himself. And in the villages, when sickness came, healers moved quietly from house to house, carrying herbs, charms, and whispered prayers older than the church itself. The old faiths had not died. They had gone underground, like roots sleeping beneath frost. In some lonely glen, an old woman might still place milk by a standing stone, or a shepherd might murmur thanks to the hill spirits before crossing a river. The church did not always know, and sometimes did not wish to, for the priests, too, had grown from the same soil. They, too, heard the wind in the trees and felt the ancient pulse of the land. The countryside was changing. Wooden halls gave way to stone keeps, not yet castles, but signs of a harder, more organized world. Lords began to claim more than loyalty. They claimed land, and with it, the lives upon it. Peasants worked the same fields their fathers had, but now they did so under banners and oaths. Still, for most, life remained what it had always been, the turning of seasons, the rhythm of work and rest. In spring, the plows carved brown lines through wet earth. In summer, scythes whispered through tall grain. In autumn, hands gathered apples, nuts, and barley. And in winter, they waited, mended, told stories. The year itself was their teacher, its patience infinite, its lessons endless. To live through the cycle was to understand the island better than any scholar could, to know when rain would fall by the smell of the wind, to read the clouds as if they were books, to walk by starlight as though guided by memory alone. Trade bound the island together, and beyond its shores lay new worlds of wonder. Ships sailed to the Franks, to Ireland, even to far Byzantium, carrying wool, tin, and dreams. They brought back silk, spices, coins, stamped with foreign kings. Every object from afar seemed a miracle. A glass bead from Venice, a book written by a man who had seen deserts, a sword of steel so bright it looked like frozen lightning. But perhaps the greatest import was not treasure, but idea, the quiet sense that Britain, once so broken, might again belong to the wider world. In the minds of kings and monks alike stirred a vision, not of empire, but of unity, of an island that could speak with one voice. It was not yet real, but it was enough to begin the long imagining that would one day give birth to England, Scotland, Wales, names that did not yet fully exist, but were already forming like light through mist in the hearthlit evenings. When the sky turned violet and the last birds called across the fields, people still gathered as their ancestors had. The hall would smell of smoke, ale, and roasted meat. Someone would take up a harp, someone else would begin a story. The tales were no longer only of gods and giants, but of saints and kings, of love lost and found, of journeys taken and never completed. Each story was a small fire against the vast dark. The children would fall asleep before the ending, their dreams blending with the words, their breathing soft and steady. The old would stare into the flames and see both the past and the future in its dance, the rise of cities, the fall of empires, the endless return of morning. It was, in such moments, simple and unremarkable that the soul of Britain truly lived, not in the halls of rulers or the ink of scribes, but in the quiet sharing of warmth and memory. And so life in the Dark Ages, though poor, though brief, though often cruel, was never empty. It was a long twilight where light and dark mingled until they became something gentler, a half-lit world of endurance. People believed in destiny, but also in work, in miracles, but also in the soil beneath their feet. Their prayers rose like smoke, uncertain, imperfect, but sincere. They built not monuments of stone, but legacies of survival. And from that survival came culture, language, faith, all the things that make a people. If you listen closely enough to the wind that sweeps over the ancient hills, even now, you might still hear them, the echoes of plowshares, the laughter from a distant feast, the faint ringing of a church bell in the fog. The island remembers everything, because history, at its quietest, is not about kings or wars or inventions. It is about breath, the endless breath of those who came before us, who lived and loved and hoped without knowing we would ever exist. Their days were short, their comforts few, but their endurance carved the shape of all that followed. The so-called Dark Ages were not a void. Within their dimness, the first outlines of the modern world were being drawn. The light never truly went out. It only changed its color, soft and golden, hidden behind clouds, waiting for dawn. As the last centuries of the so-called Dark Ages drifted slowly toward the horizon of a new world, Britain stood not as a broken relic of the past, but as a quiet promise of what was yet to come. The mists that had once hidden its roads and forests were still there, curling over the moors at dawn. But within those mists now moved the shapes of a people awakening to their own name. Villages had become towns, monks had become teachers, kings had begun to see beyond the edges of their valleys. Yet for most, life went on as it always had, simple, rhythmic, unhurried, bound to the seasons and to the soil. The earth, damp and dark, still gave what it could. The rain still whispered against wooden roofs. The smoke still rose each morning from small hearths that had burned for generations. The people did not think of history. They thought of bread, of warmth, of the coming spring. But in their quiet persistence, history itself was being made. Slow as the growth of moss on stone, patient as the tide, the age of learning had returned. Though not in the marble halls of empire, but in the candlelit corners of abbeys, the sound of quills and prayers mingled with the low chant of psalms, and through these small acts, memory was reborn. Monks who had once hidden from raiders now became the keepers of law and knowledge. They wrote not only of saints, but of kings and weather, of births and deaths, of the strange signs that crossed their skies. In those pages, written on fragile parchment with ink that still smells faintly of soot and wine, lies the heartbeat of a forgotten people. They did not know they were preserving a world. They thought they were only serving God, but their faith, steady and human, built the bridge between what had been lost and what would come. Through their words, the silence of centuries was given voice beyond the abbey walls. Life continued its stubborn rhythm. Farmers still rose before dawn, their breath white in the cold air. Women still spun wool by the hearth while the wind howled outside. Children still ran laughing through puddles, their feet bare and red with mud. Every sound, The creak of cartwheels, the barking of dogs, the tolling of church bells echoed through the narrow valleys like the pulse of something eternal. And above it all, the sky stretched endless and gray, full of both sorrow and peace. It was not a grand world, but it was whole, built not upon riches or conquest, but upon endurance. And in that endurance there was beauty, the kind that does not shine but glows softly, like embers beneath Ashdod. In time, new powers would rise. The Danes would come again, not only as raiders, but as rulers. The Saxon kings would forge alliances, break them, and forge them anew. Alfred, the wise and weary, would teach his people to read once more, and from that small act, an entire language would bloom like a field after rain. The island would no longer be a collection of tribes, but something beginning to imagine itself as one, a kingdom of words, of faith, of shared struggle. And yet, even as new walls rose and new crowns were forged, the spirit of the Dark Ages lingered, like a quiet hum beneath the louder song of progress. The patience, the humility, the closeness to earth, these were not lost, only transformed. The people had carried them too long for them to ever fade. Sometimes, at night, travelers would still gather in the dim light of a hall, passing a horn of ale from hand to hand, telling stories older than any book. They would speak of the first kings, of dragons that slept beneath hills, of saints who had walked upon the sea. The fire would crackle, the shadows dance, and for a few timeless moments, the centuries would fall away. In those voices, one could hear Rome and Albion, pagan and Christian, myth and truth, all mingled together into the single murmur of the island's soul. History, in its truest form, was not written in ink, but spoken in warmth and breath. It lived in the mouths of those who refused to forget. As dawn touched the horizon, the world looked unchanged. The same rolling hills, the same winding rivers, the same smoke drifting skyward. Yet something had shifted. The people had learned to see themselves not as survivors of darkness, but as keepers of light. Their world was still rough and uncertain, but within it burned a quiet understanding that the story never truly ends. It only changes its telling. The Dark Ages had not been an age of ignorance, but of gestation, a slow gathering of roots beneath the soil before the bloom of centuries to come. And though they never knew it, those who lived and died in those shadowed centuries had given the world something rare, the gift of continuity, the unbroken thread between what was and what would be, even now. When we walk the green lanes of Britain, when we touch the stones of its old churches, when we listen to the wind move through its ruins, we are walking with them, the farmers, the monks, the weavers, the nameless millions whose footsteps shaped the path before ours. Their laughter, their toil, their faith still cling to the air like mist. The light that guided them was not bright, not dazzling, but steady, the kind of light that survives storms and time alike. And perhaps that is why we still remember them, even when we pretend we do not, because somewhere within us we carry their same quiet endurance, their same longing for meaning in the midst of shadow. And so, the Dark Ages end not with a shout, but with a sigh, a long exhale of time. The world stirs, the bells ring, the parchment dries. The monks lift their heads and see morning through the high windows. Outside, the fields shimmer with dew, and the first bird of the day sings across the damp air. The light is soft, fragile, and endless. The island, once lost in silence, begins to hum again with life. History continues, as it always has, not as a march, but as a breath. The Dark Age was never truly dark. It was simply the space between heartbeats, the pause before the next note in the endless song of humanity.